The war was supposed to end Russia. That was the calculation stated openly by Western officials, reinforced by sanctions packages, weapons deliveries, and unanimous declarations from NATO capitals. Russia would be isolated. Its economy would collapse. Its military would fracture. And Ukraine, armed and supported by the most powerful alliance in modern history, would push back the invasion and emerge sovereign and intact. That is not what happened. What happened instead is one of the most consequential strategic reversals of the 21st century, and it unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, across 3 years of grinding attrition that the Western public largely stopped watching. Russia has not won this war in the way that military victories are typically declared. There is no formal surrender, no signed armistice, no defeated general handing over a sword. But in the metrics that determine the actual outcome of modern conflict, territorial control, military exhaustion on both sides, political will among supporting nations, and the long-term sustainability of the fighting effort, one side has positioned itself to define the final terms of this war, and it is not Ukraine. As of this week, Russian forces hold more Ukrainian territory than at any point since the initial 2022 invasion. The front line, which Western analysts once predicted would collapse under Ukrainian counteroffensive pressure, has instead shifted steadily eastward. Avdiivka has fallen. Portions of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson Oblast remain under Russian administrative control. And in Brussels, NATO foreign ministers convened in an emergency session not to announce a new phase of military support, but to confront a question no alliance member wanted to ask out loud: is this war already over? That meeting, its tone, its private conversations, and the documents circulating behind closed doors is the story we are covering tonight. Because what is being discussed in those rooms is not just the fate of Ukraine, it is the future of the Western security architecture. It is the credibility of the NATO deterrence model. It is the question of whether the United States and its European partners have the institutional capacity to sustain a long-term strategic commitment when domestic politics begin pulling in the opposite direction. This is not a story about who fired the last missile. This is a story about who outlasted whom and what that means for every country watching from the outside. The world did not see this coming, or perhaps more accurately, it saw it coming and looked away. Tonight, we are not looking away. If you have not subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. What we are covering in the next several weeks will define how this conflict is remembered and how the next one begins. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications. This story is moving fast. Let's start from the beginning. To understand how Russia positioned itself to outlast the West in Ukraine, you have to go back further than February 2022. You have to go back 30 years. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, it left behind a geopolitical vacuum that no one in Washington, Brussels, or Moscow fully knew how to manage. 15 newly independent states emerged from the wreckage of a superpower. Among them, Ukraine, the second most populous former Soviet republic, strategically positioned between Russia and Central Europe, and home to the largest share of Soviet military infrastructure outside Russia itself. From the very beginning, Ukraine's identity as an independent nation existed in direct tension with Russia's self-conception as a great power. In 1994, that tension produced one of the most consequential and ultimately hollow diplomatic agreements of the post-Cold War era, the Budapest Memorandum. Under its terms, Ukraine agreed to surrender the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal inherited from the Soviet collapse in exchange for security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Those assurances guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. They were never legally binding, and they were never enforced. That fact that Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for promises that evaporated the moment they were tested haunts every conversation about this conflict among serious analysts. It is the original sin of the post-Cold War security order. For the next 2 decades, Ukraine existed in a contested space. It was neither firmly in the Western orbit nor fully reintegrated into Russia's sphere of influence. Its politics oscillated between pro-European and pro-Russian governments. Its economy remained deeply entangled with Russian energy and industrial supply chains, and its military, underfunded and structurally Soviet in its doctrine, remained far below NATO standards. Then came 2004, the Orange Revolution. Mass street protests overturned a fraudulent election result and brought a pro-Western government to power in Kyiv. Moscow watched with alarm. The precedent that popular uprisings could redirect a neighboring state's geopolitical alignment was not lost on the Kremlin. Then came 2008. At the NATO Bucharest summit, the alliance issued a statement declaring that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO without offering either country a concrete membership timeline or action plan. It was in retrospect the worst possible outcome, provocative enough to alarm Moscow, vague enough to provide no real security guarantee to Kyiv. Russia's response came within months. In August 2008, Russian forces moved into Georgia, recognized the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and demonstrated with no ambiguity that Moscow was prepared to use military force to prevent NATO expansion along its borders. The West issued condemnations and then largely moved on. Then came 2014. The Maidan Revolution in Kyiv removed the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych from power. Within weeks, Russian forces, initially in unmarked uniforms that became known internationally as Little Green Men, seized and annexed Crimea. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists established control over significant portions of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in eastern Ukraine, beginning a low-intensity conflict that would simmer for 8 years before exploding into full-scale war. The West responded with economic sanctions. Russia absorbed them. Its economy contracted, then adapted. By 2021, the strategic picture was clear to anyone reading the intelligence assessments flowing through Western capitals. Russian forces were massing along Ukraine's borders in numbers that could not be explained by routine exercises. Vladimir Putin had published a lengthy philosophical essay arguing that Russians and Ukrainians were fundamentally one people, and that Ukrainian statehood in its current Western-oriented form was an artificial and hostile construct. In February 2022, the invasion began, and for a moment, a brief, extraordinary moment, it appeared the Western response would be sufficient. Russia's initial thrust toward Kyiv failed. Ukrainian forces, armed with Western anti-tank and anti-air weapons, performed far beyond expectations. The world rallied. Sanctions packages of historic scale were imposed, weapons flowed, declarations were made, but declarations are not strategy. And what followed was not a coordinated Western campaign to defeat Russia. It was a series of reactive decisions, each calibrated to avoid escalation, each arriving slightly too late, each slightly less than what Ukrainian commanders said they needed. That pattern of support that was always meaningful but never decisive is the thread that runs from 2022 directly to the emergency NATO meeting happening right now. History did not begin this week. It simply arrived at a destination it had been moving toward for 30 years. The NATO emergency meeting did not happen because of a single dramatic event. It happened because of a document. Specifically, a classified battlefield assessment prepared jointly by analysts from 3 NATO member intelligence services and leaked in summary form to several European outlets late last week that concluded, in language that left little room for diplomatic interpretation, that Ukraine cannot recover the territory it has lost without a fundamental escalation in Western military commitment that no NATO member is currently prepared to authorize. That assessment did not stay classified for long, and the moment its conclusions entered the public domain, the political pressure on NATO leadership to convene, to respond, and to present a unified position became impossible to ignore. Here is what we know about how this week's events actually unfolded and where the key competing narratives diverge. On the Ukrainian side, the official position has remained consistent and unambiguous. Kyiv maintains that the war is not lost. Ukrainian officials point to continued resistance along multiple front segments, the ongoing effectiveness of long-range drone strikes against Russian logistics infrastructure, and what they describe as significant Russian casualty figures that are unsustainable over the long term. President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a video address released 48 hours before the NATO session convened, stated directly that Ukraine requires 4 specific categories of additional support: advanced air defense systems, long-range artillery ammunition, expanded F-16 operational capacity, and a formal NATO security guarantee, and that without all 4, Western partners are choosing Russian victory through inaction rather than preventing it through commitment. That framing, that Western hesitation is itself a strategic decision with consequences, has been central to Ukrainian diplomatic messaging for over a year, and it is not without merit. On the Russian side, the Kremlin's public posture has been characteristically controlled and strategically calibrated. Official Russian statements this week did not use the word victory. They did not need to. Instead, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a press conference in Moscow in which he described the current military situation as reflecting, in his precise phrasing, the objective realities on the ground, and suggested that any negotiated settlement would need to begin from the recognition of those realities. Translation for anyone fluent in Kremlin diplomatic language: Russia is prepared to negotiate, but only from a position of territorial consolidation, not territorial withdrawal. Russian state media, meanwhile, has been considerably less restrained. Coverage across major Kremlin-aligned outlets this week has used explicit victory framing, presenting the NATO emergency meeting not as a moment of Western resolve, but as evidence of Western panic. That framing is propaganda, but propaganda, when it maps closely enough onto observable events, has a way of becoming self-reinforcing. Now, what does the evidence actually show? The battlefield picture, as reconstructed from open-source satellite imagery, Ukrainian military communiques, independent conflict monitoring organizations, and the partial contents of the leaked intelligence assessment presents a situation of significant but not irreversible Ukrainian strategic disadvantage. Russian forces currently hold approximately 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. The front line has been moving slowly at enormous cost in Russian lives and equipment in Russia's favor for the better part of 18 months. Ukrainian manpower reserves, while not exhausted, are under sustained pressure. Mobilization has been politically contentious, and the ammunition pipeline from Western partners, despite repeated pledges, has delivered quantities consistently below what Ukrainian military planners requested. The critical uncertainty, the variable that neither side's narrative fully accounts for, is time. Russia's military strategy has not been one of rapid, decisive victory. It has been one of deliberate, grinding attrition, designed to outlast not just Ukrainian resistance, but Western political will. And the evidence from Washington, Berlin, Paris, and Budapest suggests that strategy is producing results. In the United States, congressional support for Ukraine funding has become a partisan battleground in a way it was not in 2022. In Germany, a coalition government navigating profound economic pressure has repeatedly delayed or scaled back weapons commitments. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has positioned himself as the EU's most prominent advocate for a negotiated settlement on terms broadly favorable to Moscow. And in France, President Macron's occasional suggestions of a more flexible diplomatic approach have created visible fractures within the alliance's public messaging. None of this means the West has abandoned Ukraine. What it means is that the political architecture sustaining Western support, the consensus that made the initial response possible, is under structural stress that no amount of emergency summit diplomacy fully resolves. That is the breakdown. That is what is actually happening beneath the official statements and the prepared remarks. The question that Section 4 will begin to answer is why the specific geography of what Russia has taken matters, and why, in military terms, territory is not just land. Territory in modern warfare is never just land. It is logistics. It is depth. It is the physical geometry that determines who can project force, who can sustain supply lines, and who controls the infrastructure that makes industrial-scale military operations possible. When analysts talk about Russia consolidating its territorial gains in Ukraine, they are not talking about lines on a map. They are talking about a fundamental restructuring of the military balance in Eastern Europe, one that will shape the security environment of the continent for decades. To understand why, you need to understand what Russia actually holds and what holding it means. Begin with Crimea. Russia seized and annexed the peninsula in 2014, and despite 8 years of international non-recognition, its military integration into Russian command structure has been total. Crimea provides Russia with a warm water naval base at Sevastopol, the home port of the Black Sea Fleet that Moscow had operated under lease since Ukrainian independence, but feared losing to a pro-Western government in Kiev. The strategic value of Sevastopol cannot be overstated. It is Russia's primary power projection platform into the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Losing it was, from Moscow's perspective, an existential strategic threat. Holding it permanently is, from Moscow's perspective, a non-negotiable outcome of any settlement. Then move to the Donbass, the industrial eastern heartland of Ukraine, encompassing the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. This region is not agriculturally or symbolically significant in the way that, say, Kiev is. Its significance is industrial and infrastructural. The Donbass contains some of Europe's largest coal reserves, significant steel production capacity, and a dense network of rail and road infrastructure that connects Russian supply chains directly into central Ukraine. Control of the Donbass gives Russia a continuous land bridge from its own territory through to Crimea, eliminating the logistical vulnerability that plagued the peninsula's supply lines during the early years of the conflict. That land bridge, achieved through the capture of Mariupol in 2022 and the subsequent consolidation of the Zaporizhzhia corridor, is arguably the single most consequential territorially achievement of the entire war, not because of what it gives Russia today, but because of what it denies Ukraine permanently. A Ukraine without a continuous southern coastline cannot fully develop as a Black Sea trading power. A Ukraine that cannot threaten the land bridge cannot credibly threaten Crimea, and a Ukraine that cannot threaten Crimea has, in operational terms, lost its most powerful strategic leverage point in any negotiation. Now consider the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe, currently under Russian administrative control. Its status represents one of the most dangerous unresolved elements of the entire conflict. Russian forces have used the plant's presence as a form of implicit strategic deterrence. Any major Ukrainian military operation in the region risks triggering an incident at a facility whose safety systems have been under sustained operational stress since the occupation began. The International Atomic Energy Agency has issued repeated warnings Those warnings have not been acted upon in any meaningful military sense because acting upon them carries risks that no Western government has been willing to publicly accept. Control of Zaporizhzhia, both the region and the plant, gives Russia a form of leverage that exists entirely outside the conventional military calculus. It is not a weapon, but it functions like one. Further north, the grinding Russian advance through the Donetsk Oblast toward the logistical hub city of Pokrovsk represents a different category of strategic threat. Pokrovsk is not famous. It does not appear in most Western news coverage, but military analysts tracking the conflict closely have described it as one of the most critical nodes in Ukraine's entire eastern supply network. It is a junction point, the intersection of road and rail corridors that feed ammunition, reinforcements, and equipment to Ukrainian forces across a wide front segment. If Pokrovsk falls, the ripple effect on Ukrainian operational capacity in the east would be immediate and severe. As of this week, Russian forces are within striking distance. Step back further, and the geographic picture becomes even more stark. Russia now controls territory that creates a continuous defensive line of significant natural and infrastructural depth. Attacking it requires Ukrainian forces to advance across open terrain against prepared defensive positions, precisely the conditions under which the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, equipped with Western armor and trained in NATO combined arms doctrine, failed to achieve its objectives. That failure was not a failure of Ukrainian courage or competence. It was a failure of resources meeting reality. The weapons arrived too slowly. The training was compressed. The mine density in Russian defensive belts exceeded what Western planners had modeled. And the air superiority that NATO doctrine assumes, the air cover that makes combined arms breakthrough operations possible, was never provided, because providing it would have required NATO aircraft over Ukrainian skies, a threshold no alliance member was willing to cross. The strategic geometry, in other words, was never aligned for the outcome the West publicly declared it wanted. That is the military picture, not a defeat in the classic sense, but a consolidation of advantage that, left unaddressed, becomes permanent. And permanence in geopolitics is another word for facts on the ground. When the history of this conflict is eventually written in the cold, unsentimental language of strategic studies rather than the urgent vocabulary of breaking news, the analysts and intelligence professionals who were paying closest attention will not be remembered for what they predicted. They will be remembered for what they said clearly at the time that political leaders chose not to act upon because the warnings were there. They have been there for years. Begin with the intelligence community assessments that have shaped and in some cases failed to shape Western policy decisions throughout this conflict. In the months preceding the February 2022 invasion, American intelligence assessments were, by the public record, remarkably accurate. The CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency correctly identified Russian force positioning, correctly assessed Putin's intent, and correctly predicted the initial invasion timeline with a precision that surprised even some senior NATO officials. That intelligence was shared with European allies. It was shared with Kyiv. And the dominant reaction across multiple capitals was skepticism, a reluctance to believe that a full-scale land invasion of a European country was genuinely imminent in the 21st century. That institutional reluctance to accept intelligence assessments that challenge prevailing assumptions is not unique to this conflict, but its consequences here have been severe. Fast forward to the present. According to assessments that have been partially disclosed through congressional testimony, European parliamentary briefings, and the now widely reported leaked NATO analysis, the intelligence community picture of the current battlefield is not ambiguous. Analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency, according to reporting from multiple credible outlets, have assessed that Ukraine's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations is significantly degraded and unlikely to recover without a qualitative and quantitative escalation in Western military support that current political constraints make improbable. That is not a fringe assessment. It is the mainstream analytical conclusion of the institutions whose professional function is to provide accurate strategic intelligence, regardless of its political convenience. Think Tank and Policy Institute analysis has reached broadly similar conclusions through independent methodologies. The Institute for the Study of War, one of the most rigorously sourced open-source conflict monitoring organizations covering this war, has documented in granular detail the incremental Russian territorial advances that have accumulated over the past 18 months. Their analysts have been careful to avoid the language of inevitable Russian victory, noting consistently that the war's outcome remains contingent on Western policy decisions. But their battlefield tracking data tells a story of directional momentum that is difficult to interpret optimistically without significant assumptions about future Western behavior. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, based in London, published an assessment earlier this year arguing that the fundamental miscalculation of Western Ukraine strategy was the assumption that sanctions-driven economic pressure would constrain Russia's military production capacity on a timeline relevant to the battlefield. That assumption has not been validated. Russian defense industrial output has, by most credible estimates, increased significantly since 2022, aided by supply chains running through third-party states that have declined to enforce Western sanctions, and by a wartime economic restructuring that has prioritized military production at the expense of consumer welfare in ways that an authoritarian system can sustain far longer than democratic governments typically model. Military analysts with direct operational experience have added a layer of professional assessment that carries particular weight. Retired General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of United States Army Europe, has been among the most consistent and specific voices arguing that Western support for Ukraine has been calibrated to prevent Russian defeat rather than achieve Ukrainian victory, a distinction with enormous strategic consequences. His argument, made repeatedly in public forums over the past 2 years, is that the West's incremental approach, providing each weapons system only after extensive deliberation, always one step behind the battlefield requirement, has given Russia the gift of time to adapt, time to absorb losses, time to restructure its military approach, time to wait for Western political will to erode. That argument has not been seriously rebutted by Western officials. It has largely been ignored. Academic voices in the field of international security studies have raised a parallel concern that operates at a different level of analysis but arrives at a compatible conclusion. Scholars of great power competition have noted that the Western response to the Ukraine invasion, whatever its moral clarity, has demonstrated to revisionist powers globally, most critically to Beijing, that the costs of territorial aggression, while real, are manageable, that the international community will impose sanctions, provide support to the defending party, and issue declarations, but will stop short of the direct military commitment that would make aggression genuinely prohibitive. That signal, broadcast across 3 years of conflict, is not lost on the leadership in Beijing as it calculates its options regarding Taiwan. It is not lost on Iran as it assesses its regional posture, and it is not lost on North Korea, whose arms transfers to Russia, documented by Western intelligence and largely unimpeded, represent a direct material contribution to Russian battlefield capacity that would have been considered an extraordinary escalation threshold in the early months of the war. The expert consensus, assembled from intelligence professionals, military analysts, policy institutes, and academic strategists, converges on a conclusion that is as strategically significant as it is politically uncomfortable. The West entered this conflict with overwhelming advantages in economic power, technological capacity, and institutional legitimacy. It has not translated those advantages into a battlefield outcome because translating them would have required a level of strategic commitment and risk tolerance that democratic political systems operating under short electoral cycles and volatile public opinion have proven structurally unable to sustain. Russia understood that from the beginning. That understanding, cold, patient, and institutionally embedded in Russian strategic culture, is what the experts are now describing not as a prediction, but as an outcome. Section 6, opposing view plot alternative interpretations, but the other side has a point. And intellectual honesty, the kind that separates serious analytical commentary from ideologically convenient storytelling, requires that we engage with it directly without dismissal and without condescension. The narrative of Russian strategic victory, however well supported by battlefield data and expert consensus, is not the only credible interpretation of where this conflict stands. There are serious analysts, experienced diplomats, and credible voices within the Western policy community who push back on the victory framing, not because they are naive about Russian capabilities or intentions, but because they believe the framing itself is premature, politically motivated, and strategically counterproductive. Their argument begins with a fundamental challenge to the metrics being used to define winning and losing. Territory, they argue, is not the only measure of strategic outcome in this conflict, and in some respects, it may not even be the most important one. Russia entered this war in February 2022 with a stated set of objectives that went far beyond territorial acquisition. Putin's own public declarations, the essays, the speeches, the justifications offered to the Russian people and to the international community described a mission to denazify Ukraine, to prevent NATO expansion to Russia's borders, to restore what he characterized as the natural cultural and political unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, and to demonstrate that the post-Cold War Western-led international order could be challenged and revised by force. By every one of those original objectives, Russia has failed. Ukraine has not been denazified, a term that had no operational meaning and served primarily as domestic propaganda justification, but whose failure is nonetheless measurable in the fact that the Ukrainian state, its government, and its national identity are not only intact, but arguably stronger and more cohesive than at any point in the country's post-Soviet history. NATO has not retreated, it has expanded, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance in direct response to Russian aggression, adding over 1,300 kilometers of new NATO border with Russia. The Ukrainian people, whatever the complexity of their pre-war political identity, have undergone a profound and probably irreversible consolidation of national consciousness that makes the premise of cultural reunification with Russia a generational impossibility. And Russia's demonstration of military power, intended to signal dominance and deter Western interference, has instead exposed the structural limitations of a military that, despite enormous numerical advantages, required years of grinding attrition to achieve incremental gains against a significantly smaller and less resourced opponent. These are not trivial failures. They are strategic failures of the first order. There is also a credible economic counterargument to the narrative of Russian resilience. Yes, the Russian economy has adapted to sanctions. Yes, defense industrial output has increased, but the adaptation has come at costs that are deferred rather than avoided. Russia's budget deficit has expanded dramatically. Its sovereign wealth fund has been substantially drawn down. Inflation is running at levels that the Russian central bank has struggled to control through interest rate increases that simultaneously suppress domestic investment and consumer activity. The demographic cost of the war, in casualties, in the emigration of educated and skilled Russians who left the country in large numbers following the 2022 mobilization, represents a long-term structural wound to Russian economic and technological capacity that will not appear in this year's GDP figures, but will compound over decades. Some economists who specialize in sanctions regimes and wartime economic analysis argue that the Russian economy is not resilient, it is running on reserves. And reserves, by definition, run out. The diplomatic counterargument is perhaps the most politically significant. Several European governments, and this includes voices not easily dismissed as Kremlin sympathizers, have argued that the framing of this conflict as a binary between Ukrainian victory and Russian victory has actually constrained the diplomatic space necessary to reach a negotiated outcome that, however imperfect, could stop the killing and stabilize the situation on terms that preserve Ukrainian sovereignty over the majority of its internationally recognized territory. Former senior diplomats from Germany, France, and several Nordic states have argued in public and in private channels that the window for negotiation has repeatedly been closed, sometimes by Ukrainian decisions, sometimes by Western encouragement, and at least once, according to reporting that has never been fully disputed, by direct pressure from Washington and London on Kyiv to walk away from preliminary talks in the spring of 2022 that might have produced an early ceasefire. Whether that early negotiation would have produced a durable outcome or simply given Russia time to regroup for a more devastating second campaign is genuinely unknowable. But the argument that diplomacy was systematically deprioritized in favor of a military solution that the West was never fully committed to delivering is not a fringe position. It is a serious critique that deserves serious engagement. There is also a counter-argument that specifically targets the defeatist political dynamic now visible in Western capitals. Analysts who reject the Russian victory narrative point out that Western political will is not a fixed variable. It is a function of leadership, framing, and strategic communication. The erosion of public support for Ukraine in the United States and parts of Europe is real, but it is not inevitable, and it is not irreversible. It reflects, in part, a failure of Western governments to articulate clearly and consistently what is actually at stake, not just for Ukraine, but for the broader security order that protects every NATO member. If the argument being made tonight that Russia has quietly won this war becomes the dominant frame in Western public discourse, these analysts warn it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The perception of inevitable Russian victory suppresses political will, reduces support, and accelerates exactly the outcome it describes. That is not an argument for optimism as a strategy. It is an argument for precision, for resisting the gravitational pull of narratives that, however evidence-based in their construction, can themselves become instruments of the outcome they analyze. The truth, as it almost always is in conflicts of this complexity, sits in the tension between these interpretations rather than cleanly on either side of it. Russia has not won, Ukraine has not lost, but the trajectory is real, and trajectories, unlike outcomes, can still be changed. Wars do not stay inside their borders. That is the lesson history teaches with consistency across every major conflict of the modern era, and it is the lesson that the Ukraine war is now delivering to a global audience that in many cases stopped paying close attention somewhere between the second and third year of a conflict that was supposed to be resolved long before now. The consequences of what is unfolding in Eastern Europe are not abstract. They are not confined to the foreign policy pages of newspapers that most people do not read. They are moving through the global economy, through military alliance structures, through energy markets, and through the daily material conditions of ordinary people in countries that have no direct stake in the conflict and no vote in its resolution. Begin with energy, because energy is where geopolitical conflict most directly translates into lived experience for civilian populations worldwide. The European energy crisis, triggered by Russia's invasion and the subsequent severing of Russian natural gas supply chains to Western Europe, has not resolved. It has restructured. European nations scrambled with remarkable speed to diversify away from Russian energy dependence, building new LNG import infrastructure, signing long-term supply contracts with Gulf states and the United States, and accelerating renewable energy deployment at a pace that would have seemed politically impossible before 2022. That restructuring has been genuinely significant, but it has also been expensive. The cost of that energy transition has been absorbed in large part by European consumers and taxpayers, contributing to inflationary pressures, industrial competitiveness challenges, and the political discontent that has fueled the rise of nationalist and Russia-accommodating political movements across the continent. In Germany, Europe's largest economy and the industrial engine of the European Union, the combination of high energy costs, reduced export competitiveness, and the economic shock of decoupling from Russian supply chains has contributed to a prolonged period of economic stagnation that German economists have described, with characteristic understatement, as a structural challenge. What it looks like in practice is factory closures, reduced investment, and a political environment in which the parties most skeptical of continued Ukraine support have gained ground in successive regional and federal elections. That is not a coincidence. It is a transmission mechanism, the channel through which the costs of the war travel from the battlefield in Donetsk to the voting booth in Bavaria. In the United States, the economic consequences have been less acute but no less real. Defense industry supply chains have been stressed by the sustained demand for artillery ammunition, air defense interceptors, and armored vehicle components that the Ukraine support effort has generated. The drawdown of American stockpiles, particularly of 155mm artillery shells and Patriot missile interceptors, has created readiness gaps that the Pentagon has publicly acknowledged and that military planners describe as a direct constraint on American capacity to respond to a simultaneous crisis elsewhere. If a conflict were to erupt in the Indo-Pacific today, the United States would enter it with ammunition reserves that are measurably below pre-Ukraine war levels. For the American taxpayer, the cumulative cost of Ukraine support across military assistance, economic aid, and refugee support coordinated through international institutions has now exceeded $100 billion. That figure is debated in its precise composition depending on the accounting methodology used, but its political significance is not in dispute. It has become the central exhibit in the domestic argument against continued engagement, a number large enough to generate genuine public reaction, deployed by opponents of Ukraine support with considerable effectiveness. In global food markets, the consequences have been severe and disproportionately felt by populations in the global south. Ukraine and Russia together accounted for approximately 30% of global wheat exports before the war. The disruption of Ukrainian agricultural production and export logistics, combined with Russian manipulation of grain corridor agreements, drove food price spikes that contributed to food insecurity crises in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Those crises have receded from Western headlines. They have not receded from the communities experiencing them. The geopolitical consequences extend well beyond the immediate theater of conflict. In Asia, the war has accelerated a strategic realignment whose long-term implications may ultimately prove more consequential than the war's territorial outcome. China has watched the Western response to Russian aggression with the focused attention of a government conducting real-time intelligence analysis on the credibility of its primary strategic adversary. Beijing has noted the limitations of the sanctions regime. It has noted the erosion of Western political will. It has noted the gap between declared objectives and delivered commitments. And it has drawn conclusions not publicly stated, but visible in the pattern of Chinese strategic behavior about what a future confrontation over Taiwan might look like and how long Western resolve might realistically be sustained. That calculation made in Beijing's leadership councils may be the most dangerous consequence of this entire conflict. Not the territory Russia holds in Ukraine, but the lesson China believes it has learned about the West's willingness to pay sustained costs in defense of a rules-based international order. In the Middle East, the conflict has reshuffled relationships in ways that confound simple narratives. Gulf states that were expected to align firmly with Western pressure on Russia have instead pursued a studied neutrality, maintaining energy relationships with Moscow, refusing to join sanctions coalitions, and in some cases quietly expanding economic ties with Russia as Western companies withdrew. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have both hosted Russian officials at moments of maximum Western diplomatic pressure without apparent concern for the reputational consequences. For NATO itself, the structural consequences are significant and not yet fully visible. The alliance has been stress-tested by this conflict in ways that will require years of institutional reckoning. The burden-sharing debates that have characterized NATO politics for decades have intensified. The credibility of Article 5, the collective defense guarantee that is the alliance's foundational commitment, has not been directly tested, but the political dynamics surrounding Ukraine have raised legitimate questions about whether that guarantee would be honored uniformly across all member states in a genuine crisis. And then there is the dimension that connects most directly to the individual viewer watching this video, the cost of living pressures that have defined the political economy of Western democracies since 2022, the inflation, the energy bills, the grocery prices, the interest rate increases that raised mortgage costs for millions of homeowners are not solely attributable to the Ukraine war, but the war has been a sustained contributing factor to an inflationary environment whose political consequences have reshaped governments across Europe and contributed to the most volatile electoral landscape in the Western world since the 1930s. When you pay more to heat your home, when your grocery bill is higher than it was 3 years ago, when the interest rate on your mortgage has doubled, the Ukraine war is part of the explanation. Not the whole explanation, but part of it. That is not an argument for abandoning Ukraine. It is an argument for understanding the full cost of the choices being made and for demanding that political leaders be honest about those costs rather than obscuring them behind the comfortable distance of geopolitical abstraction. The world is not watching this war from a safe remove. It is living inside its consequences. Every day the conflict continues without resolution, those consequences compound. And the question of what happens next, which is where this documentary concludes, is therefore not just a question for foreign policy professionals and alliance managers. It is a question for everyone. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. And before we look forward, it is worth pausing briefly, precisely to separate what we know from what we do not. Because in a conflict this complex, surrounded by this much competing narrative, the discipline of distinguishing confirmed fact from reasonable inference from genuine uncertainty is not a minor analytical courtesy. It is the foundation of everything. Here is what is confirmed. Russia controls approximately 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, including Crimea, the majority of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and significant portions of Zaporizhia and Kherson. That territorial control has been consolidated through administrative integration, military fortification, and infrastructure investment that makes rapid reversal operationally implausible without a fundamental change in the resources available to Ukrainian forces. Western political support for Ukraine, while not collapsed, is under structural stress in the United States, Germany, Hungary, and several other NATO member states. The emergency NATO meeting convened this week in Brussels was not a meeting of unified resolve. It was a meeting called precisely because that resolve is fractured and because the fracture is now visible enough that pretending otherwise is no longer diplomatically sustainable. Russia's defense industrial output has increased during the war. Its economy has adapted to sanctions at significant deferred cost. Its military strategy of grinding attrition has produced incremental but directionally consistent results on the battlefield for the better part of 18 months. Ukraine's military capacity remains significant. Its forces continue to fight with effectiveness that commands genuine professional respect from military analysts across the ideological spectrum. Its long-range drone program has demonstrated the ability to strike deep inside Russian territory, including attacks on Moscow area infrastructure in ways that impose real costs on Russian civilian and military systems. And its political leadership has maintained a coherence and communication effectiveness that has sustained Western public sympathy, even as political will among governments has wavered. Those are the confirmed facts. Here is what remains genuinely uncertain. The precise contents and conclusions of the full classified NATO intelligence assessment have not been publicly verified. The internal deliberations of the Brussels emergency meeting, the actual positions taken by individual member states behind closed doors are not fully known. The true state of Russian military casualty figures, which both sides have strong incentives to misrepresent, cannot be independently verified with precision. And the sustainability of Russian domestic support for the war, which Putin's government manages through information control, nationalist mobilization, and the suppression of dissent, is a variable whose breaking point, if one exists, is not visible from outside the system. Now, what happens next? There are two credible forward scenarios. They are not equally probable, but both are possible, and the difference between them will be determined by decisions made in the coming weeks and months in Washington, Brussels, Kyiv, and Moscow. The first scenario is managed escalation toward negotiated settlement. In this scenario, the NATO emergency meeting produces not a new military commitment, but a new diplomatic framework, a quiet acknowledgement among Western governments that the military path to Ukrainian territorial restoration is not achievable on any timeline that Western political systems can sustain, and that a negotiated settlement, however painful in its territorial concessions, is preferable to indefinite conflict that continues to consume Ukrainian lives, Western resources, and global economic stability. That settlement would almost certainly require Ukraine to accept, at least de facto, if not de jure, Russian control over significant portions of its internationally recognized territory. It would require security guarantees for Ukraine that stop short of formal NATO membership but provide meaningful deterrence against future Russian aggression, potentially including a permanent Western military presence on Ukrainian soil, bilateral defense treaties with key NATO members, and a continued flow of defensive military equipment. It would be deeply unsatisfying. It would be politically painful for every leader who signed it. It would be described by critics on multiple sides as appeasement, as betrayal, as strategic surrender, but it would stop the killing, and it would provide a foundation, imperfect, contested, and fragile, from which Ukrainian reconstruction and long-term security could begin. The second scenario is strategic drift toward Russian consolidation. In this scenario, no new diplomatic framework emerges. Western support continues at its current insufficient level, meaningful enough to prevent Ukrainian collapse, insufficient to enable Ukrainian recovery. The front line continues its slow eastward drift. Russian forces reach Pokrovsk. The logistics network feeding Ukrainian eastern defenses degrades. Manpower pressures on Kyiv intensify. Western publics, exhausted and economically stressed, continue shifting toward parties that advocate disengagement. And Russia, without ever formally declaring victory, achieves through patience and persistence what it could not achieve through the initial blitzkrieg that failed in the spring of 2022. In this scenario, there is no dramatic ending, no signing ceremony, no moment of clear resolution, just a gradual transition from active conflict to frozen conflict, a new line of control that the world slowly, reluctantly begins to treat as permanent, even as it refuses to formally recognize it as legitimate. That is the more dangerous scenario. Not because it ends worse for Ukraine than the negotiated settlement in territorial terms, the outcomes may be similar, but because it ends without a framework, without security guarantees, without a structure that constrains future Russian behavior, and without the political clarity that would allow Western democracies to recalibrate their security commitments and rebuild the deterrence architecture that 3 years of Ukrainian conflict have revealed to be more fragile than anyone publicly admitted. The developments to watch in the coming days and weeks are specific. Watch the official communiqué emerging from the Brussels NATO meeting. The language it uses or avoids will signal whether the alliance is moving toward a new military commitment or toward a diplomatic off-ramp. Watch the next congressional vote on Ukraine supplemental funding in Washington. Watch whether Germany's new government moves to accelerate or further delay the Taurus cruise missile decision that has been deferred for over a year. Watch Zelensky's next major address. Its tone will reflect what Kyiv has been told privately by its Western partners that it will never say publicly. And watch Moscow. Watch for any signal in Lavrov's press conference language, in the tempo of Russian state media, in the positioning of Russian diplomatic personnel, that the Kremlin believes the moment for a negotiated consolidation of its gains has arrived, because that is the signal that will matter most, not the emergency meeting in Brussels, not the congressional debate in Washington. The signal that will define the next phase of this conflict is whether Vladimir Putin believes he has already won enough to stop, or whether he believes the trajectory is sufficiently favorable that waiting costs him nothing. History suggests he is patient. History suggests he plans in decades, not news cycles. And history suggests that when he calculates he has achieved the essential strategic objective, the permanent severance of Ukraine from NATO's trajectory, the consolidation of a land bridge to Crimea, the demonstration that Western resolve has limits, he will present the world with a choice between a negotiated reality and an indefinite continuation of a war that the West has already shown it cannot win on Ukraine's behalf. That choice is coming. It may already be here. What is confirmed tonight is this: the war that was supposed to end Russia has not ended Russia. The sanctions that were supposed to collapse its economy have not collapsed it. The weapons that were supposed to restore Ukraine's territory have not restored it. And the political will that was supposed to sustain Western commitment has not sustained it at the level the military situation required. None of that means the story is over. Stories of this magnitude do not end cleanly. They transition into new phases, new frameworks, new configurations of power and resistance and negotiation that carry the unresolved tensions of the previous phase forward into the next. Ukraine is not defeated, Russia has not won, but the world that existed before February 2022, the world in which the rules-based international order was imperfect but broadly functional, in which territorial conquest by a major power was treated as genuinely intolerable, in which the Western alliance could project strategic unity in the face of direct challenge, that world has not survived this conflict intact. What replaces it is the question that will define the next decade of global politics, and we will be here covering it, analyzing it, refusing to look away every step of the way. If this documentary has given you something to think about, something to share, something to argue about with the people in your life who need to understand what is actually happening in the world, then do one thing before you leave. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is already beginning, and you will not want to miss it. This has been a Rachel Maddow-style analysis. The situation is still developing. Stay informed, stay engaged. The world is watching, and so are we.